Hello, it is now 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You have joined Transforming Systems Strategies for Gender Responsive Reentry and Crisis Response webinar. To allow for additional sign ins past the hour, we'll be starting in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you for joining today's webinar called Transforming Systems Strategies for Gender Responsive Reentry and Crisis Response. My name is Niara Boyd Watson, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I will be facilitating today's webinar. Next slide. To give you an outline of today's webinar, first I'll provide a brief overview of the CSG Justice Center and the introduction of our speakers. Then we will learn about the need for and importance of gender responsive systems. After that, we'll cover the unique needs of women with justice involvement and gender expansive people and best practices to assess those needs. And finally, we will learn concrete strategies to apply gender responsive framework that meets the needs of women with justice involvement related to your work, services, and systems. We will also have time for questions and answers before wrapping up. Anytime during the webinar, you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and entering your question. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to rely on technical questions in the chat as we go. For the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and address them at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter technical audio problems during this webinar, refer to the information that is posted in the chat. Please understand that there are some technical issues that we may not be able to resolve. We are recording the webinar and we will post it along with the PowerPoint slides on our website within 1 to 2 weeks. Next slide. The Council of State Governments Justice Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that combines the power of membership association representing state officials in all three branches of government, with the expertise of a policy research team focused on assisting others to attain measurable results. Our staff develops research-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. This slide describes a bit more about our work style and how we strive to reflect Justice Center core values, which include a commitment to being independent and nonpartisan in every part of our work, providing rigorous, trusted, high-quality analysis, developing practical and innovative solutions informed by data and research, promoting collaboration and building consensus, and being inclusive and respectful of diverse views and experiences. Next slide. The overarching goals that guide our work at the CSG Justice Center are to break the cycle of incarceration, advance health, opportunity, and equity, and use data to improve safety and justice. The CSG Justice Center is committed to advancing racial equity internally through our work with the states, local communities, and tribal nations. We support efforts to dismantle racial inequities within the criminal and juvenile justice system by providing rigorous and high-quality research and analysis to decision makers and helping stakeholders navigate the critical and at times uncomfortable issues the data reveals. We rely on stakeholder engagement and other measures to advance equity, provide guidance and technical assistance, and improve outcomes across all touch points in the justice, behavioral health, crisis response, and reentry systems. We are excited to partner with the Center for Effective Public Policy, or CEPP, on today's webinar. Joining us, we have Erica King, Senior Manager, Center for Effective Public Policy at the National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women, and Christy Puckett, the Gender Justice Policy Advisor at the Center for Effective Public Policy at the National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women. Erica King, Senior Manager, has a focus on advancing gender equity and evidence-based practices for the last 20+ years. She has been involved in the development of gender-responsive and trauma-informed interventions to include living safely and without violence, creating regulation and resilience, or CR/2, and creating Calm, the Resiliency Builder series. Erica King has also built pathways with women and gender expansive people to build personal and political change strategies. Next slide. Christy Puckett, a Gender Justice Policy Advisor, is also an organizer and civil rights activist who uses direct experience with poverty, drug addiction, domestic violence, and incarceration to impact gender justice at the local, state, regional, and national levels. She has sat as the chair on the Women in Incarceration Work Group for the North Carolina State Reentry Council Collaborative, and also has been a commissioner at the North Carolina Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Criminal Justice System. She is also a Dogwood Award recipient for her tireless advocacy for pregnant women that are incarcerated. I am now going to pass it over to Erica, who will share a little more about CEPP and review why gender justice matters.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get into it. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our colleagues at CSG and Yara for sitting with Christy and I this afternoon. The Center for Effective Public Policy is working to build a world where justice ensures strong and healthy communities for everyone. We've been at it for about 40 years now, working with policymakers and practitioners in communities to provide training, resources, and team building. We host the Community Supervision Resource Center, as well as the APPR Advancing Pretrial Policy and Research Initiative. And we can share some more resources at the end of this presentation about that. Next slide, please. And a little bit about the National Resource Center for Justice Involved Women. This was started by BJA in 2013, and CPP has kept their commitment to center gender equity in their work. And I'm proud to have joined CPP's team for almost 2 years now to continue to build that work out with my amazing partner in justice over here, Christy Puckett. Thank you, Christy, for being with me today and for being with all of us. It's been quite a couple years. So yeah, we're working to center what's happening with women and gender expansive people in this justice system, which sometimes gets invisibilized or ignored in this field. So we thank you for all signing on today, and let's see what we can do to transform systems. Next slide, please. Okay, so goals for the webinar. We want to make sure that we're all sort of understanding the need and why this is important. Why are we talking about women and gender expansive people? What are the needs? What are those system changes that tend to help, especially when you're doing community work? And I know the focus of this webinar is community well-being, right? Both reentry and crisis response. And so you have a real opportunity here as first responders to create diversion from the system by better understanding what women's needs are in the justice system. Sometimes those gender neutral, tools we have, or those, screening tools don't do a great job of picking up some of the things and best practices that really make a difference with women. So we're going to focus on some of those today. What are some of those concrete strategies that can meet the needs of women and that can focus on you and your health and well-being too, because this work is not free on your nervous systems either. It's very difficult work sometimes. And so we want to learn from women that are involved in the justice system directly. We want to learn based on those experiences and see what we can do to reduce harm for staff working in the system and for the women and folks that you are supervising and supporting. Next slide, please. So why gender justice? Why now? Let's talk about it. Let's get into it. Next slide. So you have an opportunity to interrupt a pattern. I don't know if this is news to anyone, but the rise of women's incarceration has been going like this, straight up in the last 30, 40 years. And it makes no sense when you look at women's crimes, when you look at public safety. So we have an opportunity to, and a responsibility when we're talking about systems change, to really interrupt practices that harm, erase, or disempower women and families. And they also burden taxpayers by not paying attention to gender. Just right off the bat, we'll say that most of, women and gender expansive people in the system are primary caregivers. And there's another generation of children that are right behind. And so the decisions we make, the practices we make really matter. Women are the fastest rising population in corrections. And while the smallest, still, it won't stay that way for long if these trends continue. And 60% of those women are in jails, not in prison. So we have a real opportunity upstream to sort of interrupt pretrial, and then 80% are mothers. Most are primary caregivers. You look at the data categorically, there's a high number of people there for nonviolent offenses. We look at parental incarceration. It's a public health issue contributing to the adverse experiences of children. I know many of you have heard about the ACEs. Having a parent that's incarcerated is 1 of 10. And so and we have this history in the field in our systems of having gender neutral approaches that either over or underclassify women that might have a lot of needs but be low risk, sometimes pop up on these tools as high risk and get over supervised and over surveilled and under supported. Or sometimes when they don't pop up on a risk score but still have needs, some of those needs get ignored. And so you're in a great position, those of you that are working in reentry and response, to really be able to better understand and respond to those needs and promote practices that stabilize and unify families and help women to do better. Next slide here. So again, just a little bit more. We said fastest growing incarcerated population, but posing really little risk to public safety. However, any single report you look at, if you look at calls to ERs, if you look at UCR, uniform crime reporting data, if you look at DV hotlines, sexual assault hotlines, overwhelmingly, being in a female body or a female identified body is more likely to have you victimized. And once you're in that system, you may be experiencing poverty and other things that bring you to crime. And so when you're working on reentry and crisis response, the needs are complex. It's not just one thing. Those financial fines and fees can really hurt. So women might be less likely to afford money bail. And we see in report after report that women are more likely to return for technical violations than they are for new crimes. And inside, more likely to be written up for sort of minor disciplines. And this has, as we mentioned before, severe consequences for children. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to bring this forward today. Next slide, please. Just to give you some numbers, this is a recent report from the Prison Policy Institute. I know that we have a lot of people in here, over 100, so you might be working in different sectors, but all of these women, most of them are eventually coming home, right? 77,000 coming home from state prisons, 84,000 in local jails, another 16,000 in federal jails, and then almost, over 800,000 on some sort of community supervision, probation and parole, post disposition. So there's a lot of opportunities for intervention here, and we hope to highlight some of those with you today. Next. And just a note about language, as we are focusing and when we're using the word women, I want to make the point that we are including non-binary, transgender, and all gender expansive people too, who tend to follow these same patterns that women follow in the data, and sometimes worse in terms of housing instability and use of segregation and use of punitive responses. So when we're saying gender justice, we're including women, non-binary, and transgender people, or folks that are gender non-conforming. Next slide, please. And so just lifting up that they are overrepresented in the criminal justice system compared to the general population. And non-binary people experience more restrictive housing, more solitary confinement than the general population. And they're almost 4 times more likely to be victims of sexual violence inside than the predators of it, right? And so those are sometimes myths that we have to dispel. The risk for sexual violence, for them being victimized inside, is high. And then healthcare needs are often inadequately resourced for gender expansive people. That includes pregnant and parenting people, and Christy will talk about that as well. Safety rights are often not upheld, and this can lead to acute mental health issues, substance abuse, suicide, early mortality in prisons and jails. So these are one of the reasons why we're really focused on this today. Next slide, please. So victimization, I don't know if you're measuring it in your systems, but I've seen as high as 90% of women that at screenings that are victims of multi types of trauma, both in their childhood and currently. And until recently, we weren't even assessing that. We weren't even asking about trauma at the front door, right? We weren't asking, and we considered it non-criminogenic, that it's not driving. But we know that interpersonal and structural trauma must be addressed if women and gender expansive people are going to heal. And we're in a system where we tend to emphasize individual factors, right? And we disregard kind of those structural things like racism and safe housing and financial and criminal records and felony disenfranchisement, substance abuse, and the criminalization of addiction, medical issues and medical stability and access to healthcare. All of those structural things press on women and girls and non-binary people in the system. And then we tend to take an individual approach to intervention and kind of ignore those structural. So part of the answer is, can we hold that both and? Can we think about structurally what might be going on for her or them? And can we emphasize individual interventions that might help address and give her choice and give her more responsibility of how she is moving through these systems with you? Next slide, please. And so soon I'm going to turn it over to you, Christy, but to go more deeply into this. But we know that women have unique pathways into the system. It's not as neat and tidy as what we have seen in pathways research for men and boys. We know that trauma, adverse childhood experiences, some of those do lead to behaviors that lead to criminal justice involvement. And those are things that are that the woman or girl has done before the age of 18, before they've even become an adult to do a criminal behavior. We know that those adverse childhood experiences can be a driver, right? There's research out there, and we'll put some links in the chat around trauma to prison pipeline, right? And trauma can lead to survival behaviors like self-harm, high-risk behaviors, difficulties in school. Monique Moreau wrote a book called School Pushout. That term, shout out to her, that sometimes the criminalization of Black girls in schools, tends to be not a dropout, but that we tend to push people out with harsher disciplinaries in our response in those systems. And those structural factors that I mentioned before, like housing, mental health, substance abuse, protective relationships, social capital, that sense of belonging. Do I have a place to go? If I want to go to the gym, if I want to go to a community center, if I need a loan, do I know how to get that? And do I have positive pro-social relationships, people that really hold me down? And then I don't want to dismiss the protective factor of education and employment. This is a really hard one for a lot of women who have, spent time out of the workplace, either due to criminal justice involvement, due to being a primary caregiver and parenting. Education and employment can be a really important and powerful protective factor if we address it, and really get in the way and hamper if we kind of ignore it and leave it alone. So helping her to find, what is her path? What is it going to be? Is it school? Is it a trade? Is it a job, and how to be successful in those jobs? Those kind of things are really, really important. Next slide, please. So I want to focus a little bit on this column of the right. For those of you that are working with women and non-binary people right now, it's not that those gender neutral factors on the left that we've all seen in your risk assessments are not relevant for women, but we found in studies of women only that some factors come up as more salient. And what I mean by that is more predictive for women, right? It's not that those things on the left that are gender neutral don't predict for men and women. It's that if you look at studies with women only, poverty predicts, childhood victimization and abuse predicts, unhealthy intimate relationships and partners and domestic violence predicts, mental health issue, lack of education and employment, and lack of safe and affordable housing. So when you're focusing on interventions, really focusing on that right column, right? That sometimes our standardized assessments might not lead us right there or might not help us to prioritize that. But we see when we do prioritize that with women, they tend to be able to, it addresses the left column too, but in a much more meaningful way to them, meeting them where they're at. Next slide, please, Sam. And so some of the things that we'd love you to consider as you are, developing your interventions, developing your plans, is a holistic approach for women, right? You may have a role to do a specific piece of this puzzle, but if you can build a team of others around her and help build that collaborative, that continuity of care. So it's not her like managing, oh, I got to go to childcare and then I got to go to prenatal and then I got this parenting and I've got a counseling. If you can link arms with other providers and really build that team and that collaboration and do that with her, we see women take huge steps forward, huge step forwards. If we remain compartmentalized and fragmented in a system where like other things she has to manage, and we don't have that team-based approach. So if we can sort of think about those holistic things that she might need, and then how to build a team with her that's on her side to address these things, we have seen women really make some amazing gains in community. And speaking of one of them, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Christy. And
Thank you
Sam can
so
do
much. So you've heard Erica really break down the state of incarceration of women and girls right now, how we've gotten here, some of the history, where we are currently. And so I'm going to address, why does any of this matter? And so before I get into the slide, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience within the criminal legal system so that you can understand the perspective that I bring to the work, and that the perspective that I bring is rooted not just in my experience, but the experiences of the many women who was incarcerated with, who I've worked with, who I've organized with, who I've built power with over the many, many years. I was a young mother. Here, I live in North Carolina, and I was experiencing extreme domestic violence. And when I say extreme, I was shot, stabbed, I've been raped on multiple occasions, strangled, beaten to unconsciousness on multiple occasions by my partner at the time. And the first time I was ever arrested in my life was as a victim of domestic violence. But the police came to my home, said that they were tired of coming to my house every week, and so they were going to arrest me so that might disrupt or interrupt this pattern of violence that I was experiencing. That didn't do anything but teach me not to call the police and not to rely on the system at all. And so I relied on the resources that were readily available in my neighborhood. And in Black and Brown communities, the resources that are readily available when you are trying to escape is drugs and alcohol. And as a result of the abuse, I became a cocaine addict, a crack cocaine addict. And as a result of all of that, found myself incarcerated. Not just incarcerated, but incarcerated while pregnant. And so why does it matter? It matters because when we ignore someone's gender, we ignore the impact of the decisions that we make or don't make. I never received any prenatal care. I was incarcerated the entire pregnancy. I took a plea deal to get out, and 5 days later, I had a set of twins. I found out on the delivery table that I was having twins. And the reason that I took the plea deal was to avoid the shackling that I knew I was going to face while in labor. And so women, jails and prisons weren't built with women in mind. So we are ad hoc in those facilities. There oftentimes aren't menstrual products. There aren't contact visitation rooms for us to have contact visits with our children. If we are postpartum, there's no mechanism for us to store our breast milk so that we continue to feed our children and create healthy babies moving forward. And so when we ignore those things, when we ignore gender, we also are ignoring the very specific circumstances and outcomes that can result. We know, again, from Erica's original presentation earlier, that 80% of women in jail are mothers. Most, like myself, are primary caretakers. Next slide, please, Sam. So the lack, yeah, that's right. That's the right slide. My little thing is a little different. That's okay. So when we have a lack of gender responsive supervision, it negatively impacts community supervision. Nearly 800,000 women are under community supervision, right? So probation is also the most underfunded agency in the criminal justice system. Here, where I live, the caseloads have grown exponentially over time. The intensity and dosage of those things vary across agencies. We have seen a rise in the number of people here, and I'm sure in North Carolina, I know it's a national trend where people's substance use disorder is being criminalized at a higher rate. So women and girls who are need health care are receiving prison terms. And so the care still does not occur within the prison, and they come home and they reenter, and they are on the caseload of probation officers who may or may not have access to the resources. Their risk levels of women vary in community supervision. The needs varies, but what we know is if the needs are met, the more that we can meet the needs of our caseload, the risk decreases. So as needs are met, risk goes down. So if you're looking at your highest risk people on your caseload, I submit to you that those are the people that have the highest needs as well. If you can start to address some of their needs, then you will begin to address the risk as well, and you can see their risk begin to go down. Next slide. So the standard conditions of supervision. These are what most probation officers, when I was on probation officers, this was what I had to contend with along with some other ones. But what does it mean? How does gender impact all of these standard conditions? So if you say, obey all laws, well, women and non-binary people on probation, especially those who are primary caregivers, can face unique barriers like needing flexibility for childcare. So the gender biases can also sometimes lead to harsher scrutiny of women regarding compliance with laws affecting child custody or child care. If you say report to your probation officer as directed, that can pose logistical challenges for women who often bear, again, a greater responsibility for family care. Finding childcare or balancing reporting with caretaking and work responsibilities can add stress. If you say pay all your court fees and fines, women earn less than men. So if you are ordering me to pay money and I don't make as much, then that means that I have to work harder just to pay the fees, the fines, the restitution, and all of those things. Maintain employment, school, or vocational training. Well, it can be hard for women, especially again, those with young children, to find jobs with flexible schedules, adequate pay, do not use, possess, or drugs or weapons. The stigma around substances is higher amongst women, especially if they are mothers. So if you are a mother and involved in the system, your motherhood is automatically called into question. And if you are substance using, you are viewed as a bad parent, automatically a bad parent, a bad mother. And so the stigma can be higher for women. So this can deter people from seeking treatment. Saying do not use is just not realistic for a person who's currently using. If it was that easy, they would have stopped way before they got on probation. So the fact that they are continuing to use means that they have a real issue that needs to be addressed, but they may be afraid to even talk about it because they don't want to be violated. They don't want to quit dip or whatever the process is in your jurisdiction. And then to attend treatment as directed. Well, if you order me to 28 days, if I not even order, if I'm ordered to 28 days, or if the assessment says I need 28 days, as a mother, that can be a lot to have to be gone from my children for 28 days. Again, to try to be present in your children's life and to be removed from them can be very stressful. And so treatment has to be gender responsive as well. Okay. Next slide. Now, we know as probation officers, you guys have a lot of discretion when it comes down to, you have your standard orders that we just went over, your standard conditions, but then you can add on other additions. And so what is the gendered impact when we do those things? So if we submit to warrantless searches, I know as a woman who has been searched on multiple occasions, it makes me feel more exposed, especially if my children are there. It can feel highly invasive. So these searches can disrupt the family routines, cause embarrassment, affect relationships with children, partners, your neighbors. And I don't know how y'all come, but in my state, they come in full body armor, looking like the SWAT team when they come just to make sure you're home. And so, like, if you come to my door and I have neighbors, or maybe my neighbors didn't even know I had, or the landlord didn't know I was justice involved, but they see you coming, big probation officer on, they're going to know for sure, right? That can feel very invasive. I'm not being able to travel without permission. Sometimes when you have, again, these child caregiving responsibilities, you might have to travel for family emergencies or to care for children or aging parents. And so having these travel restrictions can make it difficult to fulfill these familiar roles oftentimes that women play in their families. Staying away from certain places and certain people. Whew. This condition is harder for women to navigate because we are required to avoid, if we are required to avoid certain people with whom we share child rearing or family duties, like ex-partners or relatives, that can be very difficult. And as a survivor of abuse or domestic violence, avoiding people is essential, but it may also restrict them from accessing those familial support systems like family members or neighborhoods. Again, having to complete those community service classes. You want to have gender specific experiences such as trauma from abuse. That requires tailored courses that understand underlying issues. I've seen women who were victims of violence be sent to anger management as if the onus of their abuse was on them. And so that would be inappropriate, right? You don't want to re-victimize people who are already victims. And again, when we talk about submitting to alcohol and drug testing, that can be very invasive. And again, you have to take the test. In my experience, the PO goes into the bathroom stall with you, is watching you as you provide the sample. It's very invasive, very, very invasive. And that can, again, feel very disarming and uncomfortable for a lot of women. I had to submit to a DNA sample. And while this condition generally affects men and women similarly, women who have survived trauma, assault, or abuse may have increased anxiety about law enforcement having access to their DNA. And it can contribute to the feelings of loss of bodily autonomy. And then I know a lot of folks are using the GPS. That I've worn the ankle monitor in the past. I can tell you that it can limit job opportunities. If you're telling me that I'm supposed to go out and get a job and do all these things to meet the other conditions, pay the fees, pay the fine, you got this big ankle monitor on my leg, it's difficult for me, for an employer to see me as a viable employee in that way, right? And it's unrealistic to expect me to wear pants all the time, right? And to try to cover it up. It can be cumbersome having to charge it up at all different times, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some of the conditions that we know people are routinely placed on, but those are some of the ways in which gender can impact those conditions of supervision. Next slide, please, Sam. So what are the common issues that women have? Well, those unmet needs that we talked about that increase the risk, those needs are subject to gender, race, and wealth-based disparities. So women can have a harder time obtaining housing. If you make less money, but are still required to make 3 times more than the rent, that can be a huge barrier. Employment and housing due to lack of childcare. There are financial, again, women make less than men. For Black women, there are huge medical disparities amongst Black women who are childbirthing. And so people don't seek the treatment and the healthcare that they need, whether that's mental health or substance use. Lots of people are parenting the way that they were parented. And so they just not received training. We call it gentle parenting today, right? But a lot of people didn't receive gentle parenting as a child growing up. So they don't have any concept of what does that even mean. And if we don't address the intimate partner violence that the majority of women are experiencing, then we will continue to see these women in and out of our doors and on our caseloads. And again, the fees and fines. All of these things are cumbersome to women, especially when they don't make as much money. So those are going to be the issues. Anytime you are assessing, uh, it's anytime you are adding a condition on to for someone, if they are a woman or a girl, you really need to think about, is this going to cost? And if it does cost, will they be able to? Are we creating success or are we creating failure by this condition? Next slide, please. So, technical violations. I was an absconder, y'all, okay? And so I say that not in a proud way, but I say that so that you understand that I understand why people don't go back to court, why people dip off, don't report in, don't call in, whatever it is, the mechanism, why they go move and don't tell you. Um, well, technical violations are a huge driver for the recidivism and the incarceration. Of course, absconding is re-traumatization, and the ACEs. If we see those things that are those things are present, the likelihood of reincarceration is going to be high. But if we get those needs met, if we help them find jobs, if they can get into that school, if they can reunify with their children and have a strong family support, if they can get that house or that housing and it is stable, we see that the well-being and safety increases, right? And so their risk goes down as their needs are met. And I think you're going to hear us say that a lot more times throughout this so that you get it, that the higher the risk, the higher the need. If you want to lower the risk, lower the needs. Next slide, please. So, as you heard me say, that society has a lot of expectations about women, how we show up in the world, right? And women, there's a quote that we have here, that women with a prison worker are seen as having committed two offenses, one against the law and one against society, basically is what it's saying, because society has a prescription of how women are supposed to show up. Women are not supposed to be in jails, prisons, and detention centers, according to society. And when they aren't always accounted for, as we have learned throughout this presentation. Next slide. So here, we're going to take a break from me and Erica just talking to you all and give you a moment to reflect. And we want you to reflect on what are some of the ways you already work to build community-based reentry strategies and crisis responses. How do you already do this? And so as you're thinking about that, how does race, class, culture, or geography inform your work? How does trauma inform your work? And we want you to put those things in the chat. And again, what are some of the best strategies you already use to reduce harm to and support women and gender expansive people? What are you already doing? We want to hear it from you directly so we can uplift your efforts already. We're going to take just a minute to do that. Oh, I see in the chat, this is really one dear to my heart. One organization I refer women to provides a mommy and me program where women can live with their babies up to a year old. That's so sweet. That's so necessary. It's so necessary. And again, and I like that Tara referred to an organization that she partners with. There's not, you don't yourself, your organization may not have the capacity to do all of the things, but it is important that you have connections to your community. So using community ties, other organizations, being a good partner is going to be crucial as you meet the needs to decrease the risk. So thank you for uplifting that, Tara. All right, and I want you all to keep on reflecting. We're going to move through, and so that we have enough time to get through everything and to continue to have questions at the end. But as you think of the ways that you're already doing this, please share with us in the chat how you're doing it. Next slide, please, Sam.
Beautiful.
So,
I
thank
think
you.
that's back to me.
Erica.
Awesome.
So.
I think it's back to me. Thank you, Kelly. And please keep them coming. Christy and I would love to hear from you. I know there's a lot of people on here, and listening for an hour and a half is a little difficult. So we want to make it as interactive in the chat as we can to sort of bring your ideas and questions in. I love to think of myself as maybe a bridge between the work that's been done for the past 20, 30 years, maybe by some of the criminal justice researchers and feminist criminologists. We have had some promising gender justice developments, and I'm unsatisfied with the pace of change, of systems change, which we're here to talk about today, which means linking arms with and partnering and doing much better about working with directly impacted people, developing peer-to-peer stuff, you know, doing co-leadership together like Christy and I are doing today. I think we can get a little bit further, but I don't want to, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that many people have been working for many years to try to push on these system changes, and what it means to adopt a gender responsive approach. So we have had some movement. We have had some risk and needs strength assessments for women. You'll hear about the SPIN-W, which is a tool that I really like because it includes women's strengths as well as needs. And we see women tend to do better when we focus on protective factors. So I like that tool. There's also a WRNA, the Women's Risk and Needs Assessment. So you're seeing some assessments that are starting to take into account some of these gender responsive factors. You're also seeing the development of gender responsive supervision and casework models. The collaborative casework model that Dr. Marilyn Van Deeten put out, and others have followed suit, where we're focusing on trauma-informed approaches, and we're going to break down what that means because everybody says that trauma-informed and gender responsive as a term, and so we want to get concrete about what it means programmatically and also the way we sit with each other. Being relational, being strength-based, focusing on her dignity and her equity, right? It's not that some of these issues aren't relevant for men, right? But these disparities really are essential to address for women. And then we have programs that are gender responsive now. Christy mentioned before the harm that comes when you have women that it's a, victim of domestic violence, and we put her in an anger management program, or we put her in a BIP, a Betters intervention programs for men, even if she was the perpetrator. Those models don't hold. So we have seen an increase of programs, living safely and without violence, moving on, seeking safety, beyond violence. Those programs tend to really address some of those needs that Chrissy and I talked about and really center on the things that women really need to address. And then we have some program evaluation tools, one that's called the Supervision Agency Gender Responsive Evaluation, the SAGE, newly named, which is sort of a program evaluation tool that you could use, your agency could use, or your jurisdiction could use to self-assess. How are we doing with addressing these? Are we collecting data? How's our organizational culture in regard to gender equity? So we have some movement, and I'll put a slide in the end. I have a slide in the end about the SAGE and some of these things if you want to hear more about it. But I'd be remiss if we said we were starting from ground zero. We're not. We have a lot to build on. And we have a lot more work to do to really reduce these numbers and turn the curve of what we see of women coming into the justice system. Next slide, please. And so now I want to move us to gender responsive practices. What does that mean? What does it mean when the rubber meets the road? What are those practices? Next slide. So some guiding questions, and I see Linda on here. Linda Small, thank you, Linda, Christy, and I, and a collective of directly impacted women that I work with have kind of used 3 questions to guide our thinking of like, how are we going to go deeper with this work? And so one is, does it divert women and gender diverse people from going into the system? And Christy's going to talk a little bit about a toolkit that we all developed that we hope will help with that goal, right? What can we do to get more diversions? Are all these pretrial incarcerations necessary? And can we provide more stabilization for women and children and even parents, right? Even many women are in that tween generation where they have elder parents that they're taking care of. So does it divert people from going in the system? And then asking ourselves, does it protect and educate women and gender diverse people while they're in the system? Is there something we can do while people are in the system to educate and protect? And does it pull women and gender diverse people out of the system sooner rather than later? I snuck a resource in the chat that just came out last week from Prison Policy Institute about some of those standardized conditions that that Christy mentioned. And I think the moral of the story is if we can focus on early terms, if we can focus on less conditions and not more supervision, less conditions, people do better. People do well. Oh, Christy's got the baby. Speaking of, it's all time. It's all good here. We're bringing it all home together. Go to the next slide, please. And so some of the things that I'd ask you to look at is your own data. Sometimes I think we fall into the trap of waiting for the perfect evaluation or the research study and really not focusing on our data, or focusing on just counts of like, how many assessments did we get? How many contacts did we get? How many visits? Did we do a case plan review? And I want you to look at, in addition to that, service intensity. How intensively are we providing those services? Are we matching needs, the intensity of the services with the intensity of those needs? And can we review those reporting requirements to make sure they're not interfering with any of those needs? Can we look at our supervision approach? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the webinar, that being trauma informed during all of our interactions is essential, especially when you're doing those home visits that Christy talked about, especially if you're doing a urine test, especially if you have to make a call to child protective services around a child. Trying to do that with the way we talk, when all the programs and resources are not there, the way we talk and the way we are and sit with each other really, really matters with women, really matters. We see if we, focus on those relational skill steps just a little bit more, and not even skill steps, just focusing on humanity, dignity, giving her choice. We're going to focus on what trauma-informed means in a minute. But if we're able to shift our supervision approach, those absconding numbers come down, those technical violations come down, and those successes go up. So with that is use of graduated reinforcements and use of graduated sanctions. I'd love you to measure whatever way you can. How is that happening? Can we do something to reduce those use of technical violations? Are you able to reinforce her when she does well? Maybe if she made it 4 times in a row, you could say, we're going to have a week off, or contact standards reduce. Maybe there's a way to get a bus pass or a bus token or something to reinforce the effort. Like, hey, we know you've been making it there. We want to help make the transportation a little less burdensome, or take something off. Anything you can do. We say in the gender neutral research, 4 to 1, 4 reinforcements to every punishment. I don't think we're there with women, but we really need to get there, right? More reinforcements than punishments and threats and use of violations really does tend to help people do better in the community. So again, if you can look at your own data, your own caseload data, your own programmatic data, and like, how intensively are we able to provide super services? How do we know that we're being trauma informed? How well are we providing the services? What are our indicators of knowing that? Are we providing reinforcements and strengths? And are we providing graduated sanctions, right? Is there a few steps before saying, oh, you're going to go back, oh, fines and fees, right? Are there other things that we can do to reduce those number of incarcerations? Next slide, please. And so back to you, Christy.
Thank you, Erica. First of all, I want to say that I've looked at a lot of what you guys have highlighted in the chat. And one of the things I want to pull out is something I say all the time is meeting people where they are. That is so important, because oftentimes we meet people where we want them to be and not where they actually are. If you meet them where they are and you can still verbalize where you would like for them to be. But then in that moment, you have an opportunity to talk about what support looks like to get them from where they are to where you want them to be. So kudos for that. And for the person who put about the Healthy Start law in Minnesota, I have the honor of working with Dr. Rebecca Schaefler, who helped craft that law, and we are trying to get that passed in North Carolina as well. So thank you for highlighting that amazing work of making sure that women who are pregnant and postpartum get to remain in the community with their families. So y'all have just described in the chat what gender justice could look like. So hopefully you understand the point of us asking, because you already know what it looks like, because a lot of you are already doing it. So when we talk about equity, we hear that a word a lot, equity. Equity is about creating fair access and opportunity in the community. And I'll read the quote and then I'm going to make a point that I hope sticks with you as you move through your work. So, the quality of being fair, unbiased, and just, ensuring that everyone has access to the resources, the opportunities, the power, and the responsibility they need to reach their full healthy potential, as well as making changes so that unfair differences may be understood and addressed. Equity based solutions often involve a strategy or different or tailored treatment to ensure fairness and justice. And so you hear the word justice included in the definition, right? Equity is about today. Equity in perpetuity or equity forever is what we would call justice. So we cannot ever have a just system if we are not creating equity in that system today. Okay. So again, equity is justice and justice is equity in perpetuity. If you do not work on equity today, it's impossible to have justice tomorrow. Okay. And so when we talk about the long arc of justice, that means we got to have a long arc of consistently including equity in our work so that the long arc of justice can be a reality, not just something that we take from Dr. King's historic speech. Thank you, Sam, for advancing to the next slide. So equity, again, is about creating fair access and opportunity for everyone. That includes people who identify, whether we recognize that identity as not, okay? So across identities, we can't create an equitable system unless we understand, accept, and invest in the needs of all women and girls and gender expansive people, Black and brown women, girls, and gender expansive people, and Indigenous women, girls, and non-binary people who are part of tribal communities. There can be no equitable system if those groups are not receiving equity. There can be no justice if those folks are not receiving equity. Next slide. Intersectionality. Oof, my girl, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw came up with this term in the 90s. And if you do not know Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, she is an attorney who came up with this term of intersectionality. And she used it to describe that people hold lots of identities. And so race is the major identity in this country. You know, you can look at a person pretty well, you shouldn't, but you can pretty much look at people and tell about what race they are. Gender, up until recently was that way, right? We identified people based on how they dressed. Now you really can't do that anymore. But those were the two biggest identities that we thought about. But people have so many other identities that inform how they behave. And so it's important to know how people identify so that you can know the factors that are influencing their decisions, especially if you want them to be compliant in a community supervision program. So ignoring their race or their ethnicity it's going to be a mistake. Not taking into consideration their religion. Say you have somebody who you set their appointment for Friday at noon. Now, if they are in the Muslim community, that's the time those folks go worship. Not understanding that means that you are causing this person not to be able to go to worship in their community because they have an appointment with you, right? And so that cultural competence, that understanding intersectionality is going to be super important as you set the conditions, as you work with folks, because those intersections are ripe places for you to discriminate a person. Because if you don't recognize the identity, then you can't recognize the bias that you may hold against it. And so your propensity to do harm is greatly increased. So again, intersectionality focuses our attention on how the multiple identities can factor into discrimination and oppression function, how that can happen synergistically. And this focus on intersectionality can help us identify specific policies, processes, and laws that operate unfairly and have negative effects across people's lives experiences. Next slide, please. So I had the complete honor in over the last 2 years of working with Erica, of working with Keela Joyner, Allison Shames, Darlene George, and Sky Adams to create this participatory pretrial model that we were able to create. It was inspired by participatory defense. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Silicon Valley Debug, but it was started by a group of impacted people who began to participate in their own defense of their community members. And so we thought about that like, in the pretrial context, this is really important because when you are in the pretrial context, it's depending on how many times you've been arrested, you may or may not know what's coming what's going to be happening to you. And so people's ability to engage is diminished by not knowing what's going to happen. So again, the participatory defense is a community organizing model for people facing charges, their families and communities to impact the outcomes of cases and transform the landscape of power in the court system. It builds upon relational theory, trauma-informed systems of care, and procedural justice research. Next slide, please. So we had some goals. We wanted to reduce and eliminate the unnecessary detention of women and gender expansive people. We wanted to prepare judges, folks working in pretrial, and the people going to court to understand what the process was, what's going to be happening. We wanted to meet and understand the needs of women and girls and gender expansive people. We wanted to increase the rates of successful completion for people on pretrial release. And we wanted to be able to inform the stakeholders of the desired practices that minimize harm. Next slide, please. And so what we came up with, oh, sorry, this is our team. So there's Erica, there's Keela Allison, Judge Colin Baldwin, Judge Victoria Pratt, Elizabeth Simone, and Sean McGregor from Maine Pretrial Services. But big, huge shout out, y'all, to the person at the bottom. That's Darlene George. Darlene George is currently serving in the Maine Correctional Facility. However, she is a consultant with us. She's an amazing consultant, and she participates in lots of our webinars and really uses her knowledge of what's happening currently. She is currently incarcerated. And so we are able to glean upon what is happening. She's been there. And so as she is experiencing incarceration in real time, we can take her current experience to inform the work that we are doing to try to imagine what does gender justice really look like. Next slide, please. So you can see, it was all women, but it was also, we were diverse around where we were from, where we lived, our experiences around the criminal legal system. We were diverse around race, around motherhood. Some were mothers, some were not. Some folks had worked in the system, other folks had not. So we had a really diverse team to come up with this project. But why this project? As you heard earlier, the women in incarceration has shot up over the last 4 years. Some people say 700%. I've seen other studies that say as much as 1,000%. Almost half of the women that are incarcerated are held in local jails in a pretrial setting. And even if they are later convicted and sentenced to community supervision, a lot of folks only spend time in jail, never having gone off into prison. So 60% of women who are in jail have not been convicted of a crime, therefore are innocent and are awaiting their day in court. So avoiding incarceration is uniquely challenging for women. Women are less likely to be able to pay the bail. The reason I was incarcerated my entire pregnancy was my bail was $167,000. There was no way I would be able to ever afford that bail. And essentially they use the high bail as a no bail, right? So they make it so high that you can't get out. And so women are more likely to plead guilty as a result of that, as did I, as you heard in my story. And jails and pretrial agencies are not well equipped to meet women's needs, down from the lack of prenatal care, the lack of, y'all, they didn't even have maternity clothes. I had to wear men's clothing the entire time I was there because they just didn't account that there would be pregnant people in the jail. So yeah, jails just are not well equipped to meet the needs of women. Next slide. So we didn't just want to make like a research white papery type guide. I mean, those things have their place. I'm a lobbyist, so I love white papers, and yeah. But we also, again, we can't call our toolkit participatory and then it not include any tools that people could actually use and participate in and provide us feedback on as they implement it in their work in the future. So the three things that we created were judicial bench card. So we know oftentimes in pretrial setting, judges have those bond schedules as a card, like, oh, if you did this class B felony, it's an automatic $100,000 bond. That happens. So we thought, well, let's create our own bench card. But it's, instead of it being a punitive bench card, it's a bench card to help them think about the people who are before them. So it's not prescriptive, but it provides that framework. It asks them to ask themselves questions. It doesn't tell them what to do. It honors their power and their discretion, but it does provide a framework of questions in which they can interrogate about themselves about how they're making their decisions. So we wanted them to ask questions that will give them insight to see the humanity of the woman or the non-binary person that is standing in front of them. I like to describe it as when you read that police report or when the DA stands up and says, well, on the night in question, all these things happen. That's black and white. But now I need the judge or somebody to ask some questions so I can begin to fill that thing in with some color. Because what I did, that's a snapshot of time. But who I am is a much broader picture. It's much colorful and is much more colorful than just what I did. And so we want judges to know who a person is, not just what they've done. We also created a toolkit for pretrial service providers so that they could ask questions to women and girls in a way that would get them the information. Lots of people do not trust the system or its actors, especially if we're talking about Black people, right? And with good reason. And because of that, that you don't get all the information, especially if you ask me questions and I don't know what you asking me for, I can start to clam up, right? And so we provided a tool where pretrial practitioners could ask women questions and explain to them why they were asking the questions, not to be nosy, not to get in your business, but to meet some of those potential, to identify some of the needs so that we can identify how to lessen the risk, right? And finally, and I would say most importantly, we provided a resource for people who are going before the magistrate, going before those judicial officials, explaining to them the process, the likely process that they will be in, questions that they will likely be asked, how to answer those questions in a way that preserves their humanity, their dignity, and their power, but also doesn't keep them in unnecessarily in the system. So sometimes if you ask a person where they live, they might say, well, really nowhere because I'm staying with my friends. Well, we know homelessness can be seen as a risk, right? And a person can be locked up pre-trial because they're homeless and you don't think they're going to come back to court. What we want to tell people, what we've told people is you can say, I live with my cousin, I stay here this day. You know, you answer the question, but you answer it in a way where you're still telling the truth, but you frame it in a way that doesn't present it like you're going to be a risk, right? And so we looked at that as empowering people to be able to advocate for themselves. Yes, you have an attorney or what do you call it, public defender or whatever, but you can still advocate for yourself. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Erica to keep us going.
Amazing. Amazing. So this next slide, we developed a bench card, and I want to say that some of you asked, I noticed in the chat, some of you asked for resources. While we developed this card for judges, there's nothing stopping you from going on the website and printing it out right now as a one-pager for yourself, because you're also making, decisions every day. So we know that some of this bias has got to be explicit and some of it's got to be implicit. So what do we know about mitigating gender and racial bias? We know that sometimes bias happens when we're moving fast. Who's not moving fast these days in this work, right? Caseloads are high, needs are great. And so when we're making decisions or we're going at the speed of a habit, or instead of slowing down and really digging deep and thinking about the disparities that we're maybe contributing to, some of the research says for implicit bias to just slow down your cognitive process. When you're making a big decision, ask yourself some questions. It's not about asking her these questions, but it's about asking yourself these questions. Have I really considered this when I am making this decision? Have I considered gender? Have I considered sexual, orientation? Have I considered poverty and how that might be impacting what's going on with her? So again, it's a two-sided card. The first side of the card tells you a little bit of like what to do before and after and use it. But the card itself, and while it's for judges, you could cut off the judges part and you could just print it out and use it for yourself. Next slide, please, Sam. It looks like this. So it just is asking you, have you considered this? Asking yourself. And again, this is not an interrogation to go ask her all of these things, but have I thought about gender? If I make a decision, have I really, and then next to that, and I know it's hard to see here, but we'll put the link in the chat at the end so that you can see just the card, is a little fact and a little bit of data that might not about that disparity. And like, if you can say, yes, I thought about it, I know that and I'm still going to make the same decision, great. But maybe if you can slow it down and think, have I thought about gender identity? Have I thought about race? I'm here as a white woman doing this work. It's really important for me to not, perpetuate these racial biases. So asking myself when I'm making decisions, who I'm working with, how I'm working, how I'm designing, how far I go along in this presentation, even until I bring, Christy in. Race is an important factor. Trauma is an important factor. Have I thought about how many of these behaviors that she might be engaged in right now might be trauma reactive? And what could be put in place maybe to help with some, not always trauma healing. I don't like to see systems mandating, oh, she has to do her trauma work before she can go any further. Trauma work is a lifetime of work. And if she's in a safe place to get into that, great. But a lot of what we see around trauma is just giving her skills around grounding in the here and now. Somatics, there's a whole bunch of research. You know, we were big on the CBT and the brain down. And you're seeing so much more research on the body up and the things we can do with mindfulness, with somatic experiencing, with paying attention to brains and bodies. So have we thought about trauma? What could be happening? Have we thought about adverse childhood experiences, not just for her, but for the child? Is she a mother? Is she are we contributing to adverse childhood experiences for another generation? If we make this decision, or are her kids there? Education and employment. What are the protective factors? Am I going to be disrupting something for her if I do have to send her back? Housing. Disability is another one, right? Disability justice is huge. Do we know what co-occurring conditions women might be dealing with medically and, mental health and substance abuse wise? There's a whole bunch of research, not a whole bunch, but some compelling research to me that says when we give women resources around their medical stability, they do better in the criminal justice system, all other things aside, right? And that sort of echoes with what Christy was saying, like giving that healthcare access. Language access is another one, right? I've seen, unfortunately, women mandated to programs who are Spanish speakers, where there's no translation, there's no handouts in Spanish. Like, are we thinking about language access? Are we thinking about substance abuse and how we might decriminalize that and program it? So these are things when you're making decisions, maybe asking yourself, have I considered these factors? And if I have, great, and I'm ready to make decisions. If not, why not? How can I be sure that I'm not contributing? It's an inside job a little bit. How can I be sure that my own biases aren't reinforcing these systemic patterns? Can I use my discretion to do something against these these disparities and make a different decision and still support safety and well-being? So again, this is just like a visual aid. We know in the work of equity primes, I want to credit Race Forward and the Racial Justice Leadership Institute there 10 years ago for sort of inspiring my thinking about what we could put in. Sometimes it's a visual. You could make your own equity prime, something at your desk that's a visual. Sometimes it's a series of questions, but anything that before you make a decision that stops and helps you pay attention to the decision you're making and your discretion and how it might mitigate or contribute to barriers. Next slide, please. So the last thing I want to go to is because everybody says resources is how we communicate and how we take care of ourselves in this work, right? So next slide, please. I want to focus on you for a moment, all of you, the 113 people that are still hanging in here with us on this webinar, and just acknowledge again, like I said, this work is not free on your brains and bodies. It's difficult work, right? It's difficult work. And we know that staff facing in this work, working in crisis and reentry and community stabilization, face their own specific barriers, right? With your own health and well-being. And so it's important. And then the occupational stressors contribute to that. There's a whole bunch of research around, I don't love the term compassion fatigue, but vicarious trauma, folks working in correctional fields around life expectancy and outcomes. There are some real occupational hazards and risks that come with being first responders in this system. And so paying attention to those occupational risks, knowing those occupational hazards. And then the next level of that is organizational culture. You can be working within, your program in the context of an organizational culture that understands those occupational risks, maybe has a staff well-being work group or a strategy or some sort of staff and employee club, a good supportive supervision, a peer-to-peer group around difficult women. There's things that you can build into your organizational culture that do this. I know some of my colleagues have done things where if they are working in a program organization, they've done bulletin boards and changed the office to very images of successful women, images of successful staff. They've done things in their break room, right? To change the environment in your organization to make it more conducive and trauma informed for you, right? And then of course there's our own things. It's an inside job, right? So do we have our own skills? How's our diet and our exercise and our education? How's our social capital? Are we seeing our friends? Are we able to take care of ourselves? So we find that it's really important for staff and organizations doing this work and trying to turn the curve on these gender disparities to really pay attention to some of the occupational hazards, some of the organizational well-being strategies that you could really adopt to make it a more trauma-informed organization, and then our own things that we can do, right, to protect ourselves. Next slide, please. And I want to give a shout out to SAMHSA and the GAIN Center for sort of initiating some of this work for training for trainers and training for trainers for what it means for trauma-informed practices in substance abuse and mental health. And that is certainly relevant to the justice sphere. They have four R's that I want to talk about. And Christy and I have emphasized these a lot. The first one is realizing how prevalent trauma is. We've done that today. Respond using trauma-informed communication and interventions. We're going to talk about what that communication might sound like. Recognize the impacts of self-regulation and relationships, right? Recognize that having those executive functioning skills are something I hear from people all the time is the women are so emotional, they're so manipulative, they're so hard to work with. I'd work with 5 guys if you take this one woman, those kind of things. Recognize that self-regulation and relational approaches are really, really important, right? Recognizing that. And then the fourth and maybe the most important one is resist the urge to get confrontational and be punitive. Sometimes this work is frustrating. Punitive responses are always at the ready. And so it's having the self-discipline also to resist going to confrontation of like, well, if you didn't want to do that, why did you, if you wanted to have your kids back, why did you go use crack? Like what kind of, saying those little unhelpful statements, which we hear come out of people's mouths a lot sometimes in this work. Just if you can like monitor that, resist that writing reflex of kind of telling or problem solving for her, and instead moving to a communication style that builds agency and power with her. Next slide, please. So some of the strategies that we want is like helping her to mobilize. Trauma can be very immobilizing on a nervous system. It can help you to stay stuck or in the status quo where you are. So a lot of the work is like helping her to figure out what the action is and helping her to tap into her resources to take that action, right? Not doing it for her, not telling her what to do all the time because it just doesn't work. We don't take advice that way, right? And so tell them about the legal process and the status of their case, giving them information. We heard in focus groups that we did with women, to prepare for the toolkit, that they got very mixed and confusing messages about whether they should talk in court, whether they should, what they knew, what kind of information they got. So giving them information, offering relevant community resources wherever you can, thinking about those holistic ones. And like Christy says, you may not be the one to provide that service, but helping her to find that. And then I want to lift up peer-to-peer interventions, really, really important. We're seeing so much that directly impacted people, and the sisters in this work continue to teach me the value of peer support is more powerful for so many people than what they might be getting from professional services that are like the best available, but not always tailored, right? So building that peer support, whether it's formal or formal, and helping her to do that, tap into that social network. Paying attention to what's the least restrictive environment to support their safety and well-being. If you can avoid a return to jail or a program and do it, then please offer at least, if you can do treatment instead of jail, maybe that's least restrictive, but paying attention to that. And sometimes we, looking at the data, it would suggest maybe we're jumping to the most restrictive. And then helping to mobilize those education and employment opportunities. Those milestones of having women keep a job 3, then 6, then 18 months, right? Like really the protective factors that come when someone can keep a job longer than 9 months. right? A lot of the women that we've worked with spend 3 months here, 6 months there, very spotty. So mobilizing those things and helping to build the supports to have successful employment I've seen women be so proud, feel so much better and so much more capable when they're engaged in those kind of things. So again, not just giving strategies, but helping to support her to mobilize and take action and get out of sort of what trauma can be in a mobilized survival state. Next slide, please. A few more, just want to lift up mitigating those fines and fees whenever possible. If you have discretion to advocate to reduce those things, they are contributing to wealth-based disparities for women, and we know it. When you think of it, you add up those supervision fees, fines. I had a woman that I was working with that her daughter was in another state. If she and it's $40 for a travel pass. If she was going to keep up her reunification plan and see her daughter every week, that's what, that's $120 a month just to travel. Never mind the gas to get there. That's a lot when someone's coming, home and trying to. So any place you can mitigate those fines and fees, please do it. Giving them opportunity to share and inviting them to share their needs, not assuming that they want substance abuse treatment or assuming that AA is going to be the way for her, but just inviting them to share what is it that they need. And then working with them on their court appearance plan. We found if women are going to court or before a judge or formal, like if you can do anything to help them put their best foot forward, that's a place where, again, there's a lot of messages about whether to speak, and that causes a lot of anxiety. So being there, coming alongside. Next slide, please. And then the thing that I think is maybe most important is how we talk with each other, right? And so Keela Joyner, Marilyn Van Deeten, and I have we have a whole training around this, just trauma-informed communication skills and practicing that. And I'm going to give you like 3 quick skill steps just to kind of think about when she's coming to you in crisis. Step 1 is about you securing your own oxygen mask. So noticing like, oh, am I getting, heart palpitations because she's upset? Am I getting irritated with her because she's complaining about something? Like, what can you do to sort of bring your own temperature down, bring your own regulation first? And then before you start to solve it or fix her, because how many of us are in this work and we're fixers and we just want to jump in there with her? Take a minute to just reflect, do reflective listening. I know many of you on this training have had MI training, you've had reflective listening training, other communication skills. Use those right there. Like, don't go into problem solving right away. Just like you're stressed, you're fine, telling her, I hear you, you're financially stressed. You don't know how you're going to do this another day. You need a break or you need some support with childcare, and you really need that. And you're not sure how you're going to get to this upcoming date. Reflect that you've got the message. Something happens, Daniel Siegel talks about when we flip our lid and when we're dysregulated. And a lot of this work is about emotional regulation and taking that prefrontal cortex back online, using those communication skills to de-escalate a session. And then step 3 is getting to some sort of resolution and problem solving where it's a we versus a me versus them. Well, what do you think we could do to address this financial stress? Where do you think you might get some childcare support? Do you think there's anything I can do? And sort of seeing like, what can she do? Not going right to formal services every time, but thinking like, what are the strategies she can do and help her recognize what she can do, right? When we're not there. Because at Friday at 5, we all go home, and the weekend she's still left with all those same stressors, right? So help her anchor into what are her strategies she could do. And then who are the supports around her that can help her reinforce those strategies? Who's the first call? If she needed to borrow $50, if she needed to go to the grocery store, whatever. And then services, right? So I think of them as 3 S's, kind of like, what are the strategies? What are the supports? And what are the services that I can put around, that we can put with her? So again, just thinking about how we talk. Countless women have told us, and we probably experienced ourselves, the experience of not having someone communicate with you this way, that doesn't have a bedside manner, that's just very directive, that wants to use their power over, or is like just a cheerleader. Oh, come on, you can do it. Or does everything for her. We see that sometimes of like people with good intentions doing all the work for her. That's not it either. You're getting to a we. Thank you for your raised hands. We're going to get to the Q&A really quickly. So keep them coming in the Q&A question too, because we look forward to sort of getting into dialogue with all of you. So 3 steps. Step 1, recognize what's happening with me. Step 2, recognize and reflect what's happening with them. Step 3, moving to some shared power, some shared agency, some shared problem solving around what are the strategies, what are the supports, what are the services we can put in place to deal with whatever's coming up for her. Next slide, please. So again, we've talked a lot about gender disparities, racial disparities, class, sexual orientation, and we all have our own race, class, culture, and gender, right? That shape our perceptions. So again, just leading with respect. You're not going to be the cultural competency is a myth. None of us is going to be an expert on everything about another person, but respect goes a long way. Also being willing to interrogate your own thinking and your own potential biases, you know, about whatever it is, gender identity, falling back on your own values of your own ethics, respect, courage, integrity, your own professionalism, and centering dignity and choice when you're working with women is really, really important. Just thinking about that, holding dignity as a constant. What does she need to be her best self, to tap into her own dignity, and how can I support that? Next slide, please. And then just breaking down a little bit more before we close what we mean by trauma-informed systems of care. That word is a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot. So I want to go back to the roots of Fallett and Harris sort of asking us to think about these 5 things: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And I'd ask you to think about that in your own practice right now as we move towards closing. What am I doing to facilitate her safety? How's the trust with the women that I work with and the folks that I work with? Are there clear expectations and consistent boundaries? Do they know what to expect from me? Do I know what to expect from them? Where can I allow more choice, right? Not just my choices, but where can I help her see the choices that she has? And then collaborating, sharing power, working together, getting to that we, right? Getting to that we. And empowerment, working to build resilience, personal and social resources, that those strengths that I talked about before, those protective factors, anything that's a need could also be a protective factor if we build it up that way. So helping her to see where the protective factors exist in that same need domain. Maybe she doesn't have the parental support. I'm using Christy as an example. Maybe she didn't have the parental support she needs, but anybody can see Christy now know she's a damn good mama. And she's got a baby there, right? It's not the mothering nurtures, but maybe it's someone to tap out when she works. Maybe it's confidence when those kids hit the teen years and they start talking back, right? Figuring out what it is that's going to help people tap into their personal power. Next slide. So as we leave, I'd ask you to think about what can you do to increase the safety of the women and the gender expansive folks you're working with? What can you do to increase it physically, environmentally? That might be thinking about things about how you set up your office, even where someone sits, where the chairs are, where the doors are, what the messaging is on the room. Is it welcoming, you know? What can you do to increase the psychological safety of the women that you're working with? How about trust, especially in times of crisis response? Trust is really huge. You know, where can you increase trust and mutuality in that relationship? Next one. And it's a professional relationship, but to be a trauma-informed relationship, it really has to include these elements of collaboration, empowerment, and choice. So where can I build in choice to say something like, you know, I've been thinking about these 2 programs for parenting. One is called Mommy and Me, and it's residential. Another one is called, you know, Look Up and Hope, and it's 3 times a week. And which one do you think would be best for you right now? Right? Providing information and asking her what's best, building that collaboration and helping her to notice where she is building her skills, strategies, and supports. And, even taking the time to say, I noticed a month ago you would have called me and cussed me out over that. And now you're coming in and blah, blah, blah. So like just taking the moments to notice her strengths and help her notice them too. Really important elements of trauma-informed care. So next slide. So now I want to wrap up with some additional resources and then make some time for Q&A. I see some in the chat, yay. And we've got about 5 minutes. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. Sam, we can click through really fast. And I want to let you know that, as Niara put in the chat, these will all be online in about 2 weeks, and you'll be able to download the slides as well as clickable links to all the resources and stuff that we've put in here. So what I'd invite you to say is just a call to action. Again, Christy and I love to hear from you in the chat. As a result of this webinar, what is your takeaway? What can you commit to doing, either policy or programmatically, or on a personal level, to bring a gender justice, lens to your work? And as a result of this webinar, what do you intend to do? So please, let's light up the chat with some of those next steps and takeaways so we can see that while I roll through some of these other resources with you. Next slide, Sam. Here's a little bit of a slide about the SAGE. So I talked earlier about program evaluation, and this is the Supervision Agency Gender Responsive Evaluation. If you're a site that's looking at programmatically what you're doing, and this is generally done kind of with a system partner, a community corrections system partner, not always, but often. This is looking at what are the evidence-based practices. Oh, yay, Kelly. I'm so excited. Are you in Washington or Hennepin County? Tell me in the chat. Hennepin, yay. We love Hennepin County. Amazing place that is very committed to women. And I love it. I love that we're going to be able to go there. So the SAGE will be another process where it's helping the agency to come out with a strategic plan, right? Of what are we doing with women programmatically, in data, in our organizational culture, in all of those domains. So if you're interested in that, you can email Lori Brisbane at National Institute of Corrections. Accepts invitations to SAGE to apply. I know that Hennepin is in there, and I know we have one more site, but we do have a little bit of room for a kickoff. If there's anyone on this call that thinks you want to, try to get your system involved, please email Keela Joyner or Lori Brisbane right there. And you can see more about the SAGE. Next slide. Here's the toolkit. So if you want to see Christy and I and some of our colleagues again on a webinar where we're going to dive deeper into this toolkit, the deadline to register is November 14th. And you can see the toolkit itself as well as clickable links to download all the tools. But we will be having another webinar where we'll go more deeply into that November 21st from 1 to 2:30. And there'll be a link to register also in the slides. Next slide. We're going to go for a minute to your Q&A. So another tool. Oh, yes. The share again, the tool I mentioned beside the WARNA is the SPIN-W, the Service Planning Instrument for Women from Orbis Partners. Full disclosure, I used to work with Orbis Partners, and so I'm familiar with that tool, but I also love that, that it gives you a visual, that it gives you strengths, that it's not just a cutoff score of high or low. It sort of helps you as a practitioner to really mobilize these things. Next slide. Here's some clickable links to all of the resources that we've had in here. Next slide. I'm going to just go through these quickly so we can get some time to the Q&A. And then that's the information. Lori Brisbane manages technical assistance requests for any site that's looking for more support around gender responsive practices. You can always email Lori and submit a TA request. They don't all get funded, but a lot of them do. For folks that are working in NIC has resources available to help sites that want to dig in deeper to gender responsive practices, as well as SAMHSA and trauma-informed care. And then the last slide, just want to shout out another link of a poem that I have worked on with a lot of the women inside our Opportunity Scholars Initiative, the Place Matters program. I see Jillian Foley's on here and Linda, and the Maine Department of Corrections. And women in New York and women in Maine, formerly and currently incarcerated, have been coming together every week, developing peer-to-peer healing around in writing, through the tool of writing and sharing with each other. And they've written an anthology of poems around family, love, loss, hope, and time. And so that's downloadable for free. You can use that, and maybe you'll find a way to use it to inspire your work or share with some of the women that you're working with so that they don't feel so alone always in this stuff. And I think that's the last one, and we can go to come off slides and come to Q&A. Am I right, Sam? Is there
Yeah.
one more?
Yeah, we have about 5 questions in the chat, and I see Nicole had her hand raised. So we can do like a quick 5-minute Q&A to get you and Christy to answer some of the questions.
Great.
So first we have Naomi Charles, who says, "My question to you is, how can society change the policies? How can the situation be changed for the better so women can have more resources and assistance?"
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, the way that we change policy, to me, Christy, I know you have ideas about this as a lobbyist, but to me, it's coming up with proposals of what could work better. Developing, I love that image of, I'm trying to think of all the elements of policy change, but where you're working on relationships, you're working on power, you're working on money flows. It's a big lift to change policy. Less so starting with your organizational policy, sometimes administrative policy. Sometimes I find like corrections or criminal justice agencies can do a lot more with policy than they do without waiting for a legislative change. So wherever you have influence on policy, I would say use it and use it to build a proposal of what could work better. Christy, you have any other thoughts on policy? I know you do.
I do. So specifically, when we talk about policy, I think the issues that we have with policy right now is the policies historically have not been informed by the people who are most impacted by the policies. So anytime we want to come up with a policy, we should make sure that that policy includes the people who the policy is for, right? So if you're going to write a policy about women who are incarcerated, you should include women who are incarcerated about that policy, because there's going to be a lot of insight that they have. But more than a policy, we can create a policy, but a policy can be changed, right? If we don't change the hearts and the minds of the people who are making decisions, then we could get a law passed and they'll just repeal the law, right? Or they'll make some carve outs in a future iteration of that law. So policy is fine, but it really requires the deep work of building relationships and using those relationships to change how people perceive women and girls and non-binary people who are incarcerated, because it's what we believe about those folks that allows us for them to be treated in this way or not treated at all, right? And so if we change how we think and we feel, which I saw somebody say something about cognitive behavioral in one of the questions, if you change how you think and change how you feel, you change how you act. That also goes for system actors. So sometimes we have to provide a lot of more information so that they have more knowledge in their head and in their heart. So it changes how their hands work.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Gotta answer the easy ones first. To Lydia, is the stage available in Massachusetts? Absolutely. If you apply right now or email Lori Brisbane, I bet we could probably get you into those cohorts. Any state could apply, but I think they would want to see that your criminal justice agency system is also on board with it. And I wanted to address, is it the question around CBT, which there it is up at the top. Christy talked about that. I think ideally trauma-informed CBT. My colleague Marilyn Van Deeten and I have written a little bit about that in chapter. What we've seen a lot is women being forced into men's programs like Thinking for Change, other things that are kind of gender neutral. In general, manualized treatments or manualized programs like that can be great tools for staff to give a intervention. And when we're thinking about trauma survivors, it's a lot of asking them to get on literally the page that the manual is instead of meeting them where they're at. And so I would say both and, but if you can adapt your CBT program to deliver it in a trauma-informed way, that's the best case scenario. Or use a CBT program that was designed for women. Who's responsible for training staff within the prisons? That is that is an all over the map one. I would say most prisons that I've worked in have a training academy that coordinates prison and internal, but a lot contract or have different providers. And I know we're at time probably, so.
I would just say one quick thing. Oh, Lord, the baby's starting to cry. I would just say that regards to training, the way people are treated, they are trained to treat people that way. So when you think about asking for more training, they are trained to treat people the way they're treating them, right? And so like I'm not saying don't train people, but just it is a system, right? And so adding additional trainings doesn't always get to the root of the issue, which is seeing people as deserving and as valuable, because that's really at the root of this. Are women and girls valuable? Are non-binary people valuable? Do they deserve dignity? Do they deserve care? That is the core of the issue that we're discussing today. So like, training, yes, but also it's going to take that we build relationships with the people who are in power, because a one-off training is not going to provide the foundation that they need to provide that trauma-informed care.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christy and Erica. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to everyone in the chat, in the Q&A box. However, my email is posted here if you want to send me your questions. Again, the PowerPoint is the webinar is recorded, so in about 1 to 2 weeks, it will be available to you. That has Christy and Erica's information attached to it. And we just want to show our appreciation for taking a deeper dive into the unique needs of women and gender expansive people, and best practices to assess those needs of a unique population that some of our grantees and anyone on this webinar serve. So again, if you all were stepped out and missed a large chunk or have questions that weren't answered live, you are welcome to email them to me and I can get them to Erica and Christy and we can get them answered for you. So thank you all for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your week. And thank you for showing up.